And so now the reason you're all here, the introduction to Alteryx. We've got your presenters, Matt Heinze and Connor Kelleher. We'll turn it over to you, Matt and Connor.
Thanks, Danny. Appreciate it. Thank you all for the opportunity to participate today in the ASU Data Conference. As Danny said, my name is Matt Heinze. I am the Customer Success Manager at Alteryx, supporting all of you at ASU as you work to slay your data monsters. So we've got it set up today to give you an introduction to the broad Alteryx Analytics process automation platform before we dive into some examples of how you might use the platform at ASU. So Alteryx is the only quick to implement self-service data analytics platform that allows data scientists and citizen users alike to break the barriers to insight so everyone can experience the thrill of getting to the answer faster. So what does this mean for you at ASU? It's really all about Alteryx being an analytics platform for all practitioners, whether you're a data citizen, an apprentice, a data knight, or a wizard, perhaps call yourself a data scientist. All those folks have components of the platform that work for them and are applicable for them. So let's talk about how that works. So we've identified 3 critical success factors that stand in the way of successful digital transformation. Manual processes run across a myriad of disconnected point solutions, limited data science and analytical practices, and a disjointed workforce with no access to upskilling. The journey of digital transformation isn't just one single approach. Instead, we should think of it as 3 transformations in one: data, process, and people. Every day, I get to interact with smart people who want to be better and gain more from the data they're working with, but they're being asked to do so with the wrong technologies. The data processes they are stuck with are manual and broken, and the technologies are not purpose-built. At the end of the day, they find themselves unengaged and unmotivated. Data, process, and people, these are ASU's richest assets. The Alteryx platform democratizes data regardless of where it sits, automates business processes with repeatable workflows, and fosters the rapid upskilling of people through code-free and code-friendly analytic building blocks. By freeing up significant resources who were trapped in legacy manual and broken processes, we get to redeploy you, the domain specialist, to focus on new, innovative, or high-value work. That's the spark for cultural change to build a digital-ready, data-driven workforce. Democratizing data, analytic, automating of the processes, and upskilling. This is what the Alteryx platform does for you at ASU. This matches perfectly with the theme of the data conference, to upskill the ASU team to slay more and bigger data monsters. Our platform solves the challenges of automating the inputs from your data sources, everything from traditional data platforms, local files, and applications, to more modern and diverse sources such as process automation bots and data in the cloud. The platform unifies all these analytic steps by providing users with over 260 automation building blocks, covering the full spectrum of analytics lifecycle. And because of the tight integration of the components in the APA platform, you can start to solve from any point and progress from there. Siloed data, disparate one-off software tools, and manual process breeds a disconnected and unmotivated workforce. The Alteryx Analytic Process Automation Platform prevents this with data prep and profiling, data blending, diagnostic reporting, geospatial analytics, prescriptive analytics, and predictive auto ML building blocks delivered to you all in a code-free and code-friendly method. Whether you're an analyst living in Excel, a data scientist building predictive models in Python or R, or a robotic process automation specialist working with bots on the front end and back end, every single one of these personas and profiles can leverage the single platform to reuse these data assets from one another, stop implementing more data silos, and leverage our collective knowledge to upskill one another. That is the platform on which the Alteryx analytic automation platform was built. So how do you get started? Well, attending today's session is a great starting point. My colleague, Connor Kelleher, is going to provide a demo of the Alteryx platform so that everyone can have a better idea of the capabilities. From there, I will walk through a few of the most commonly used building blocks of the Alteryx platform and show how easy it is to get going in Alteryx Designer. For those of you for whom this is your first Alteryx experience, or for whom Alteryx is still very new, I'd encourage you to check out our Success Center. The Success Center has everything you need to get you going, including a trial download. The resources available there will help you on your journey to slay the data monsters. So Connor, I'll turn it over to you.
Apologies, Matt, I was muted there, but thank you for that intro. We're going to switch over to a demo now so you can just get a first look at the Alteryx platform and understand, what does this mean for me? How can I do my daily work in Alteryx and really take the benefits of automating these manual processes and growing yourself further into new analytic spaces you might be interested in, like spatial and predictive analysis. So I'm going to share my screen real quick, and then we'll get that demo going.
It is there now, yes.
Awesome. So what we're going to go over today is a simple problem universities are used to, just the admittance of a student. And what we're going to do with that is output several different reports based off of each state and the different counties and individual states we may be receiving students from, and understanding, some statistics about their test scores, whether that be something like the SAT, ACT, or maybe just high school GPA. And we're going to put out several diagnostic reports understanding how these populations are spread across each county and given states we're targeting, and then do some spatial analysis along the way too. So there's some fun things to do there with spatial and predictive, but the first steps to really kick this off are the data prep. So what Alteryx really enables you to do, as you're looking at my screen here, is combine all these different steps, whether that's descriptive analytics or the spatial and predictive. And as you can see on the screen, as you build that out, it's really just a sequenced audible pipeline here that you can create with your data analysis. So you may start with an input file coming from a database, or maybe it's an Access table, or maybe several Excel sheets that you've used in the past. And you'll start that transformation out and look at the data as it's coming in, and then just assess through the toolbars at the top what kind of transformation you want to do to your data. And then you'll drag that in and create that step. And the beauty of this, once it's done, is you'll go ahead and click the run button to the far right of the screen, which will then push all the data throughout the workflow, create any outputs you've designed, and therefore create a repeatable process for the next time you want to run this. So instead of doing that manual Excel calculation for each fall, maybe looking at new students, you would instead just inject your new data here, or maybe it's connected to a database, and then just open this process up, hit run, and you would get your outcomes within a matter of seconds, as opposed to maybe the 2 or 3 days that it took you to build this out the first time in Excel. So a lot of time savings to be done here, and a lot of collaboration to see across the workflow with the different data skill levels you may have, putting their skill sets into one workflow. So you could have a data scientist in here, you could have maybe a general data worker who does a lot of the prep of the analysis, and then more so getting into predictive as well. So throughout this, the outcomes that we're going to produce is, one, we're going to build several output files through a PDF that have each county and just a box whisker chart here to show what the range of high school GPAs are in a state in each county across that state. So today we're using a small sample of data. This is looking at Maryland specifically, and we have several outputs of different states, but this will go ahead and show us kind of what the average GPA is in that county, and then the upper and lower bounds, so we can understand the students that are applying to ASU. And then down below, just getting some statistics that we generated in the workflow, and I can zoom in this a little bit, but just showing average scores across several standardized tests they may have taken, their GPA, and then maybe the amount of students that have applied to ASU from that county. So just a nice report that's repeatable at the end of the day to push out to our end stakeholders. But as we get to it, there's several sections that may lead into that. And the first part is just using those simple inputs. So when a user comes into Alteryx, what they typically start off with is understanding the favorites tools here at the top. These are going to be all your Excel functions like filtering for something, maybe doing a pivot table, or just joining two data sources together. And that's what you see in the first section of my workflow here. So the inputs that we have are inputting student information, as you can see at the bottom of my data set, that has things about their MIT status, and this is historical data, and then understanding maybe what college they applied to, student groups they were interested, and whether they were in STEM or non-STEM activities in high school. And then there's also some more demographic information about the students as well in location analysis. And then down below, we have several other data sets that take in non-STEM test scores from students and then STEM test scores from students. But these are two separate files that we really need to merge together, then link up with that more demographic student information at the top so that we can get to something like a prediction. So at a high level there, really all this is done through dragging and dropping tools you may need. Maybe you're converting a date or time, just saying I have an application date and I need to switch that to a date time format that I can actually calculate what the month is or how many dates are in between when they last applied and their most recent apply. So this is really good for converting calculations, standardizing your data, and then being able to link things up in the end. So what we're doing at the bottom here is maybe we'll stack the two STEM scores and non-STEM scores together and unite them into one data set. So now we have 120,000 records in this data set. And what we'll want to go ahead and do from there is look at the primary key or the identifier of each student and link that up with their demographic information. So we have one cohesive data set to go ahead and do the more fancy analytics off of. So that's where each process starts and a lot of time savings is held. But as you develop through the workflow, you'll see that, based off your skill level and things that you want to grow into, you may be diving into the spatial tool categories at the top here to understand maybe drive times from the campus or how far in physical distance they are from a city, or maybe they're more in a rural population to understand a little bit more about location demographics for each student. And then once you do that, you can move into the predictive realms, which are kind of on the farther side of my screen here, that allow you to do anything from maybe target what a potential test score is for a student, or maybe target whether they're going to be admitted or denied to the university. And once you build out several models there, you can compare them all and really understand what's the best predictive model for me to use in the future, and then put that in place of this workflow so you have a productionalized system to go ahead and build that out and have it reproducible for every single year. So that's kind of the beauty of Alteryx and outcomes you can create. The flat files that I mentioned that are being output maybe have test scores at the end of the workflow that tell me maybe what the percentage admit or denied is for each student, so how likely they are to get into the university. And from here, I can design cutoffs and then push these out to maybe the specific college deans to have them understand what the potential students they may be having for the new year is. So several different analysis here. We're going to dive in across our sessions today and tomorrow about how the predictive and spatial work, as well as a little intro on getting your data combined today. But for this demonstration, we just want to give you a peek at what some of those outcomes are. And then the last thing here to show you is, a spatial outcome. Maybe you're using those spatial tools to take like a latitude and longitude coordinate of each student, which we have in this data set. And you're going to convert this X and Y here to maybe a point on a map, which you can see over to the left. And you can see a lot of these students are in the east. And then I can understand here, based off of these points on a map, what are my boundaries? What state are these actual students in, or maybe counties? So you'll be doing spatial processes to build out some trade areas and understand exactly the shapes of the state or the county, and then you can match where those points of each student lie within that. So these are some of the spatial processes we'll highlight throughout our demonstrations this week, but wanted to give you a nice flash of what's happening here. And then the end reports are, as you saw in the getting that PDF that we can show to whatever stakeholder, maybe college dean, that we need to display these results to on incoming students for the next year. So a lot of things you can do in Alteryx, but again, the nice thing is here, everybody, depending on their skill level, can come in, collaborate, do their part of the process, and at the end of the day, this is fully automated, so that the next year we just hit that run button, save all the time, and then we have a repeatable process to go ahead and send out to our stakeholders. So Matt, I'll pass it back to you to dive into some of the specifics of how this workflow is built out, and thank you all for attending, and look forward to giving you some demonstrations more in depth of this later on.
Thank you, Connor. As Connor indicated, we are going to kind of break apart this workflow today and tomorrow in this beginner session and tomorrow in the advanced session. So today's component will focus on the prep and blend components of the workflow. And then tomorrow we'll look more during our advanced session at the spatial capabilities and the predictive capabilities. So with that, I'm going to jump right in and share my screen. Oh, here we go. Sorry. Find the right button. Okay, so before I jump into the tools and their configuration and so on, let's do a little bit of an introduction to that designer component of the platform. So as I jump in, a couple of things I'll call out in terms of self-service resources that you might leverage as you get introduced to Alteryx. So the first is community.alteryx.com. So one of the great things about our environment at Alteryx is the participation in our community. Folks go in there to look for answers, to provide answers, to share their knowledge. It's also the home of our Alteryx Academy, where you can get interactive lessons, recorded training, and even product certification if you have an interest in becoming core or advanced or even expert certified in the Alteryx environment. And those can both be found from that Alteryx Success Center that I mentioned earlier. So in addition to a download of the trial software, you can leverage the getting started capabilities, live training, starter kits, and then just even read some other use cases from other organizations who've had success with the Alteryx platform. And in terms of assistance, you can certainly reach out to me if you have questions, but the team there at ASU is also ready and capable, particularly as you have questions about specific ASU data sources or capabilities. A number of different ways to contact them: on Slack, the Ask Analytics channel, by email, on ServiceNow, and then they have their own webpage with the support details there. So please feel free to reach out to them as well as you have your Alteryx questions or challenges. So today we're going to jump in, give an introduction to workflows. We'll talk about the use case that we're going to look at. We will introduce a few of the key building blocks within the environment, and then we'll jump right in and actually build the input, prep, and blend components of the workflow that Connor introduced you to. So let's start with the environment. So you kind of saw this on the screen as Connor was working along. There's basically four kind of areas of the designer environment that you'll need to make sure you're familiar with. So in the top, going across, is the tool palette. And so you'll see there's a number of tabs there. Each tab has a different set of building blocks, and they're each color and iconically different, so that you can tell if you're using a transform tool or a prep tool or an input output tool or the like. On the left side, for each given tool or for the workflow itself, there is a configuration capability. On the right, kind of right in the middle, is really where you're going to do all your work. That's considered the canvas. And then bottom right is the results window. So this is where you're going to come as you run that workflow. You're going to be able to come here and investigate the results of a given step in your automation sequence. So now if we think about what appears there on the canvas, the components of the workflow. So first and foremost, you've got a number of tools or building blocks that make up your workflow. They each have anchors for input and output of a tool. And then the connections between them control the flow of data from one tool to the next. And the one thing I'll call out here is that this is a very, very simple flow, one tool to one tool to one tool. At any point in these flows, you can go off in multiple different directions, as you saw with some of the spatial and predictive components of Connor's example. So as we think about that results window that was in the bottom right, this is where we can see messages, a log of the output for a given tool or for the entire workflow. If you click on the white space of the canvas, you'll see the workflow messaging in its entirety. There's really 3 levels of messages: errors, conversion errors, and warnings. If you click on the tool name, you'll actually see the specific output for that given building block. And if you click on an input or an output name here, you see the highlighted, underscored file name. If you click on that, that will open with the native application. So if you're working on an Excel file, outputting an Excel file, you can click on that and it will open up in Excel. Viewing data in that workflow, so in that same results grid at the bottom, you'll see 2 or 3 different tabs here in the bottom left of that window. So the first one was the logs that we just talked about. The second one here with the arrow is the inputs, and there could be multiple depending on the depending on the tool or the building block in use. And then the third button is an output. So again, could be multiple outputs as well. So let's jump into a few of the favorite tools. So the use case we're talking about today, Connor introduced it a little bit, but really we have a process that's used to analyze applicant data that's been created in Excel. However, that process is time consuming to replicate, it's error prone, and it is not dynamic. So how can we improve this process? Well, clearly we're going to leverage the automation capabilities of Alteryx. So our goal is to blend data from multiple Excel sources. Now, again, this is an introductory class, right? And an introduction to Alteryx. So that's why we've chosen Excel inputs. As you go forward in your journey with Alteryx, you might start with Excel outputs that come from a database that you use commonly. And then it's, a simple updating of your input tool to point to the database proper as you evolve and want to more fully automate your process. So don't be intimidated. Don't think about the first step is I have to connect to every data source I have. If you already have an output from that system, it's often easier to start with that file and then progress in your journey to connect directly to the sources. So our goal is to blend data from those Excel sources, to format values, perform calculations, and aggregate data, and then finally output to a workbook with multiple sheets, in this case by state, for colleagues across the organization to leverage. So the key processes we're going to cover, the key components, again, blending, formatting, and outputting, and you'll see there a subset of the actual building blocks that we'll go through in our workflow. So we'll just highlight a few of those. So date time, similar to most analytic and software environments, we have a specific date time format that Alteryx uses. And if you have data coming from a disparate system in a different format, we have a date time tool, a date time building block that can work with various formats, string formats, to convert them to a date time data type. Or if you're pushing it back into another system, you may want to convert it from the Alteryx datetime format to a specific string format that that system would like to see. We also have the capability to create a custom output in addition to, or input in addition to the kind of standard views that you see there on the screen. And this will create a new field. So you can go ahead and indicate the name of that new field. Converting text to columns. So very similar to what you might do in Excel, we have the capability to split a field. Strings are the only fields that can be split here. Delimiters, those could be simple as your traditional commas and pipes, could be a tab. And you see there are a couple of special characters you might use. If the number of fields is fixed, you may experiment with the number of columns there in the middle until you get to the right answer. And again, you're going to run often to help you with the dynamic setup of your workflow. And then in addition to kind of what I would consider your traditional text to columns, we also have the capability to split to rows. And as you advance, and we have some other discussions, we get into really dynamic workflows where that split to rows really makes the possibilities in terms of analyzing your data very significant and very much automatable. So the next tool we'll talk about is the union tool. So in the example, Connor had a couple of data sets that we needed to stack. The union tool can be automatically configured. It can, and that would be based on the name of the field. We can configure it by the position in the file, or we can set up a manual configuration. The data types have to match in your 2 or 3 or 4 input files. And the first row determines the field name, the first row of data. So what does a union look like? And this may be repetitive for those of you who are already apprentices or knights or wizards, but just to give you a flavor for the union tool within Alteryx, we're going to union our 2011 data with our 2012 data. And so if we use an automatic configuration of the union tool, we're going to pass in that 2011 customer data. So we'll pass across the ID and the name columns and all the associated data. And again, if we remember, automatic configuration uses the column names as the match. And so in this case, name and full name aren't matching. So we're going to create a new column, and then the data will pass across. So all of our IDs will match up, and we'll end up with a name column and a full name column. If instead we chose to use a manual configuration, we could line up name and full name so that we only have one field for name going forward. So just kind of how you compare the manual configuration and the automatic configuration with union building block. Okay, the join tool. The join building block matches by position or keys in the data. So the key fields need to have the same data type on both sides of the join, so on the left and the right, and the values must match exactly. So for this reason, we recommend using strings and not numeric, particularly decimal numeric fields. Values that there's also a select capability in the bottom area where you can select and deselect and rename fields. We'll talk about that in the demo portion here. So a sample join workflow, we might have transaction data and customer data that we want to bring together. We might have to change the data type of our customer ID in the select tool to make sure that we've got the same data types feeding that join. And then each input data set goes to a separate input anchor. And then there's 3 output anchors for the join tool. So I'll start in the middle with the J. So J for join, that is any records that match on both the left and right side. So in this case, they might have matching customer IDs. Records come out on the left on the L anchor, the top output anchor, for transactions that came from the left input anchor for which there is not a match on the right side. So in this case, transactions without a valid set of customer data. And then conversely, on the R anchor would be data from the right input, in this case, the customer data, so customers with no matching transactions. So what does that look like in terms of visualizing? So we might have two inputs here. The left input is our ID and first name, and the right input is an ID and the last name. So we're going to join these on ID. So our join output is going to bring together all the fields. So I like to say no data left behind. So whatever you came in with is going to be available to you on the output side. Whether you choose to use it all or not is a further discussion, but we're going to get the ID. And then if it finds a matching name on the right side here, it's just going to rename it to right ID, and you can fix that as appropriate when you work with the data. We're going to find a first match here for John and Deere, both with an ID of 12. And we're going to find a match on ID 36 for Jane and Doe. And so those will go to our J output. The left output is going to get Tim, ID 33, that did not have a match on the right. And then our right output is going to get Smith, ID number 2, who did not have a match on the left. So I'll leave that there just for a second. Make sure people are kind of getting the join. Great. Okay. So now we will jump to our summarize tool. So as you think about summarizing your data for sharing it with others or analysis, you might consider this as a component of what you might do in terms of a pivot table in Excel, or a group by and aggregation if you're a SQL person. So what we're going to do here is select a field in the top of the summarize configuration, and we are going to indicate an action to perform with it. So in this case, we are going to count the number of employees. So we chose employee name, and when we chose the dropdown, we chose count. And then for the base pay, we're going to go ahead and sum that. The actions change, actions available change depending on the data type. So for example, the string field that is employee name would have the opportunity to count, but it would not have the opportunity to sum, for example. And here on the right side, you can update the field names as you feel appropriate. Summarize for each, this is the group by capability. So you might want to say, okay, for each, in this case, agency, or maybe it's for each state or county you're analyzing, you want to group those to do your analysis. So it separates each of the fields into buckets based on their values. And then whatever actions, so maybe it's a sum or a count, is applied to the group. And again, same as with the previous slide, you can update those output field names. So let's take an example of what summarization looks like. So our first example will be grouping on our store letters and then counting the number of customers. So first we have our 4 stores, and for each of them we have our given number of customers. So 2 for store A, 3 for store B, and 1 for each of store C and D. So our second example, we're going to group by the customer this time, and we're going to sum up the sales. So we've got our 4 customers, Dan and Billy and so on. And you'll see for Dan, there's just the 1 record, so he's got sales of 10. For Billy, he has just the 1 record as well, sales of 30. Optimus Prime, just the one record as well, sales of 60, and then Bob has the rest, and those sum in total to 265. So that is different ways to use the summarize tool, and we'll go into some more examples when we get our hands on. So I'm not going to go through each and every component here of the comparison to Excel, but certainly this is a good starting point for people who are familiar with Excel and comfortable in Excel and want to advance their automation. In addition to what you see here on the screen and the ones I call out, there's actually a full lesson on the community in the Alteryx Academy on Alteryx for Excel users. So you can, it takes you through the steps and compares each. So a couple of things I'll call out here. The very first one, the select tool. So one of the common challenges in Excel is, every month perhaps you need to go in and bring in a data set and kind of repeat a bunch of processes, and you might format some cells, change some syntax, rename headers, and so on and so forth, delete, shift columns. And then you've got to write yourself a big process document that says, what are all those steps I need to do so that next month when you do it again, you don't forget. In Alteryx, the select tool lets you do all those things in one place. And as Connor said, once it's on there, once you've got your connection to it, it's done, it's documented, it's repeatable. All you do is kind of update your data and off you go. So again, also no data left behind, one of my favorite phrases. Change data types. You can change data types in the select tool, but what the auto field tool will is inform your decision. So you know how big the fields are in your given data set. Filter tool pretty much does exactly what it says. The sort tool, formula tool is really where you're replacing formulas like you would do in Excel. And then the multi-row tool, I think I'll call out here, as you think about what you might do in Excel in terms of referencing the previous row or the next row to build something like a cumulative sum. That's the multi-row formula in Alteryx. And then we mentioned already text to columns. Join tool is probably your closest thing to a VLOOKUP, except that you're not just getting one output or the first output like you would with a VLOOKUP, but you're getting all of the matches. We can append rows, pivot table. Again, we've got kind of three components that I think of in terms of pivot tables. We've got a crosstab, transpose, and summarize. Okay, so let's jump in. I'm going to flip over to Alteryx. And I'll just do a quick check and make sure that everyone can see my screen now that I've switched over to Alteryx. I see Victoria nodding, thank you. So when you go into Alteryx for the first time, this is basically what you will see. So as mentioned in the presentation, you have the toolbar here at the top that includes your tabs with all of the different building blocks in them. So I'm going to start on the left and just highlight a couple of them. So the favorites is either what we've selected as the favorites for you when the package was installed, or it's other tools that you've gone ahead and selected the star for to add to your favorites toolbar. So it could well be that you use the directory tool a lot and you want to star that and add it to your favorites toolbar. But that one is kind of dynamically yours to own. The input-output toolbar is exactly that. Things like browse, which is viewing within the workflow, and obviously the input data tool and the output data tool that we'll talk about today. Preparation is a number of those kind of first building blocks that you'll use as you work through your workflow. So I want to filter my data or build a new formula, or I want to use that select to rename columns, resize columns, things like that. Join we talked about, so here's where we find union and join, and then parse where we find that date time formula and text to columns. I won't go into a whole lot more of these, but here's where we're going to find the summarize tool and transform, and tomorrow we'll touch on some spatial and predictive capabilities of the platform if you attend the advanced session. In terms of the workflow itself, here, since we're clicked on kind of the white space of our Start Here workflow, you'll see how we can configure elements of the workflow itself. A little bit more advanced than we're going to talk about here today, but that's where you would set up some of the workflow configuration. On the canvas, we could certainly drag and drop any tool that we wanted to onto the canvas to start our workflow. And here we've got our results window at the bottom. And our kind of Start Here gives you a way to look at a couple of different examples and kind of, as it says, get you started with some of the capabilities. If you are confused about a given tool or capability, there's a couple of ways to kind of get yourself a little more comfortable. The first is you can certainly go and search for information. So maybe it's the input tool, and I've got the opportunity to actually click on example here and see an example of the input tool. Or maybe I want to go out to the help files to find more information on input. Or I can go out to the community. So I mentioned community as a great self-service resource. We actually have it tied into our search. So you could go and look at our tool mastery on either the text input or the input data tool, and other questions perhaps that others have asked about the input tool within the community. So now that we're ready to get going on our first workflow, we can just go ahead and hit the plus sign here and open a new tab, and we can go ahead and start our new workflow. So almost always the first step is going to be getting some input data. And there's a number of different ways that you can do that. You can simply drag and drop a file onto your canvas here, and it will automatically create an input. But I'm going to take you kind of through the complete process. So we can just, if you click on a tool, it'll kind of get bigger, and you can simply drag that onto the canvas. And now you'll see here in the configuration screen, it wants us to connect to a file or a database. So we can go ahead and hit this down arrow. And now we're given the opportunity to connect in any number of different ways to different data sets. So I have my list here of recent data sets, and you'll actually see our student information and scores. I'm not going to take the shortcut here, though, and select one of those. I'll take you through the full process. Perhaps you've got some saved connections. Here are a couple of database connections that I use on a regular basis, so I've saved those. I might want to connect to a file, so that's what we're going to do here in just a moment. I can set up a new data source. So I might want to connect to an Oracle data source using an OCI connection like you usually do there at ASU, or maybe it's SQL Server or some other data source. And then as applicable, if your company if ASU has set up some gallery data connections, there might be connections already available for you to leverage. But again, for, as you're just starting out, my recommendation is usually to start with a file, data that you're already comfortable with. And then as you progress, you can replace it with an ODBC or an OCI or some other connection as you continue your automation process. So I could select a specific file type down here. I'm actually just going to go ahead and say select file. And you'll see here, I've got my student information and student scores files. So I'm going to select first that student information file. When I hit open, Alteryx is going to go and look at that Excel file and check if it has, multiple sheets. So in this case, it just has the one, so I'll stick with that. I could actually select a specific range within that sheet, but I'm just going to go ahead and pull it all in. And then as you get kind of more into dynamic capabilities, there's the opportunity to pull in a list of the sheet names and dynamically pull more or less data using dynamic tools. So we'll go ahead here and say OK on sheet 1. And we'll quickly get a preview in the left side in our configuration screen of the data in that data set. And so you see I have a pretty nicely formed data set here. It's automatically brought in as an indication that it's a Excel formatted file, and I'm pulling in sheet 1. If you were pulling in files that were not as familiar to you, or we're going to change a little bit, you might want to output your file name as a field. And so it actually add on fields at the end. You also have the ability to start at a row further down. If someone has given you a file with a bunch of headers or some summary at the top of it, you can actually start further down. So all those capabilities here just in terms of configuring that first input. So now I've got that input brought in, and early and often, let's go ahead and hit the run button. So over here on the right, as Connor indicated, we've got the run button. So we'll go ahead and hit run. And now a couple of pieces. If we click on the white space on the canvas, we'll see that log of what happened so far in our workflow. So we started running it. We brought in 1,205 records from the student information file, and it ran in about a second. If I wanted to open that student information file, I could click on this link. I'm not going to do that here right now, but that's always available for you there to go ahead and open the file. And you can click on any of these tool names and actually go to the configuration of the given tool. So here, our input tool. So I'm going to go ahead and just quickly add those other two files that Connor mentioned, really get our scores now. So again, just the input data, drag it onto the canvas, and I'll go find the scores file this time. So again, files, select the file, scores. And again, if my data is updating on a monthly basis in these files, then next month, I don't have to redo these steps each time. The data's been updated, I hit run again, and it's going to pull whatever the latest data is in those files. So that whole automation process begins at that input component. So let me just finish this input, and I see there was something came across the chat that I'll try to answer here. So for our scores file, we actually do have two sheets. So we're going to go ahead and bring in the non-STEM sheet first. So we can just go ahead and OK. And so there's our scores based on the non-STEM. And then same thing, we can go ahead and drag and drop, or like I said, you can actually query here in the search for any of the tools. So I could actually grab the input tool from the search bar as well. But then again, the same configuration. I can go ahead and grab my scores file. And this time I'll grab that second tab for STEM and bring that in. And if we run, now we're going to have data coming in from all three of those sheets. There we go. So now each of those was read in and we're off to the races. So let me pause for just a second because I see a question came in here. So if the data on the Excel sheet is going to change or will need to be updated, what do we click? So maybe this one kind of depends a little bit on the context of the definition of change. So if the structure is going to stay the same every month, then there's probably not too much you need to do. Once we build out the workflow, at the end we will have an output tool probably. And each month, assuming the data has updated, you'll literally just come in and hit run, or you won't need to do much of anything. If the format of the file is going to change, then you would need to come in and perhaps do a little bit of work. But as we talk about in our dynamic workflows class, you can certainly automate components of that as you go to better deal with additional or changed data. So it looks like that answered Samantha's question. Thank you. Okay, so now we've got our three data sets brought in. And now we want to do some of that prep and blending that Connor mentioned. So the first component we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the student information, and we're going to see that all the way at the end here is this app date. And hopefully you can see that on my screen. And it's in this very interesting, I'll say, format that Alteryx doesn't recognize as a date, but just as a string. And so we want to just convert that to a date format that we can leverage to do calculations and the like within Alteryx. So we're just going to go up to the favorites toolbar, and you'll see that I have the date time tool in the favorites toolbar. If you are a brand new user, you won't have it there. I went into the parse toolbar and I clicked the star to put it in my favorites toolbar. But again, I could take that out and it would disappear. But again, it can always be found in the parse toolbar. So we'll just use the date time tool. We'll drag that on. And again, when you drag it on, you'll see now that we've got some tools out there, Alteryx is automatically connecting this to the tool that's in front of it. So it automatically created that line. If for some reason you drag this onto the canvas and Alteryx didn't automatically pick up that it needed to connect, you simply need to click on the output anchor from the input tool, hold and drag to the date time tool and let go, and that will create the connection for you. So that connection is vital, right? That's the data is going to flow across that connection from the input tool to the date time tool. And in this case, we are going to not convert the ID number, but we're going to look at our list and go to the bottom here, and we are going to convert the app date column. So now we can look through our list. Actually, let's first give our field a name. So we're going to call this our new app date. Very innovative naming. And we are going to look in this list and see if we have a format that matches what we're looking for. So again, if I look at my results grid here, I can look at the input data that's coming into my date time tool. I can scroll all the way to the right and I can see this app date. And so it's got the year starting, so you can kind of see the YYYs in this first example, but that's not the right format. And if I look down here, I've got another one with a bunch of Ys, but none of them kind of have this day after. So none of those are really going to work, and I'm going to have to use something custom. And so you can kind of guess, you know, some of what the format is here of this string, right? So having just looked at some of these examples, you might know that YYYY is going to be kind of how I start my conversion. And you'll see in the bottom here, it starts an example for you using, you know, the first day of 2000 to give you an idea of what this looks like. And so you could kind of maybe look at the list and try to guess what the, you know, right things to do this conversion are. But probably more helpful would be if you use the help. And so you'll see here on the left side, we've got the help button. So I can click on that, and it's going to open up the documentation for the date time tool. And it's going to help me with what I need to configure. And so we've already done some of these pieces in terms of what field and what output field. But in this case, we want to look here at the bottom at some of our format specifiers. And so one important one that we're going to look at is this DY. So this says English day of the week as a 3-letter abbreviation. So that's our day that we've got in our data set. So we're going to use that DY. And then, you know, you'll see here, if you only had a 2-digit year instead of a 4-digit year, you might use YY. But we're also then going to eventually use this MON. That is our 3-character abbreviation of the English name of the month. So now that we've got an idea of our format specifiers, we can jump back over to Alteryx, and we can proceed with our DY to give us the day of the week. And then we've got a comma in our date format. Then we've got that 3-character month. So that was MON from the help page. And then finally the day. So we can just put the 2-digit day. And that is the format for our date. And so we can go ahead and hit run. And when we do that, now Alteryx is going to give us a nicely formatted day. Now what you'll notice here is as I scroll to the right, I don't see my new field. And that happens all the time. That's because here in the bottom, you're still selected on the input side of the date time tool. Select the output side, and now you'll see that we've got a new field for new app date, and it's got all of the appropriate dates in there. Okay, so now we've got the date, and now we want to work with some of our other fields. So the analysis we're going to do is actually based on this discipline that you see here in the results grid. And the discipline, although somewhat useful, is a little bit painful because it's got kind of just two fields combined into one. So we're going to go ahead and split that up. So Danny or Victoria, please let me know if we're having challenges. I just got a little Zoom notice that I'm having trouble with my internet connection. So
Will do. It gets a little choppy, but you're doing okay.
Okay, maybe what I'll do for those, so we keep it better, is I'll just turn my video off, and hopefully that will provide enough bandwidth for the audio. But feel free to just interrupt me if things are getting too choppy. Okay, so now we've got our discipline, but we really want to convert that to two separate fields. So we talked about that text to columns tool. So that's in the same toolbar here, the parse toolbar. So again, we can just drag that, click on it, drag it right after our date time tool. And now we have that opportunity to set up the columns. So before I go ahead and set that up, I really want to remind myself why I'm setting up this specific field. You see here the date tool actually gave us that it was converting the app date. I'm going to actually go in on this third tag looking icon here and choose the annotation. And down here, this is actually going to let me annotate the specific tool that I'm working on. So in this case, I am going to let it know that I am splitting discipline. So that now is going to show up on my tool to let me know that I split discipline. And so I'll go ahead now and configure it. So I can select from my list that the field I want to split is discipline. And again, down here, I can look at my available data, remind myself that discipline has an underscore between the STEM, non-STEM, and the actual discipline. So we'll go ahead and change our delimiter from a comma to an underscore. You could actually put multiple delimiters in here. If you had an interesting file with maybe tabs and spaces or something else to indicate what the splits were. Here I'm just going to have a simple setup with two columns. And if there are extra columns, extra data, for example, maybe one of your disciplines actually had an underscore in it. By setting this to 2, then anything that comes after the first underscore is just going to be left in that last column. So that would probably do what we would want it to do in that scenario. There's other options where you can drop it, with a warning or without a warning, or you can just error out if the columns don't match up. Most often I see people leave it in the last. And then you can give it a root name for all the columns that are going to be created. So we'll just leave that as discipline for our example. And then earlier in the presentation, I mentioned split to rows. We won't go to that, but certainly you could dive into the help to get a better understanding of how you might leverage split to rows in another use case. So go ahead and hit go, hit run, run early, run often, get comfortable with your data, get comfortable how it's going to work in Alteryx. So now we can go to our output anchor from our text to columns tool, scroll all the way to the right, and now we've got discipline 1, which is our STEM, non-STEM, and discipline 2, which is actually, our discipline or our major. So great. Now that's really helpful, but now I've kind of got some duplication, maybe even some confusion about what my fields are, because I've got a date and a new date, and I've got discipline and a couple of other disciplines. So I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup. So maybe we'll pause for a question from the audience or to the audience. Maybe you can answer in chat. What tool from my favorites toolbar, if anybody remembers, that would I use to rename, remove, move around the fields that I've got here in my data set? Does anybody remember? Not you, Connor. I know you know the answer.
I think we'll have another winner in the chat pretty soon here.
Don't be shy. Got any prizes, Danny? Data cleaning. You might be able to do some data cleaning, Brendan, Scott, sorry, but nope, that's not the tool we're going to look at right now. This one that's actually in the deck. Input, no, we've got all our inputs already set up in this case. We're going to go, yeah, Phil, thank you, Phil. We're going to go ahead and use that select tool. So our select tool has a whole bunch of capabilities that we can do with it. So we just drag it on and connect it to our text to columns tool. And you'll see here kind of a number of different capabilities. So I'm going to make that a little bigger, make my field a little bigger. So first and foremost here on the left side, you'll see all these checkboxes. So this is where we can come in and turn off some of our extra fields. So the discipline that we split up, we can go ahead and turn that off. And then that app date, we really replaced that already. So I'm going to go and turn that one off as well. If we had some data types that we wanted to change, we could actually go in here and change those. I'm pretty content with our setup here, so I'm not going to change any data types, but this would be where you could do that. You could also change the size. So maybe you knew you were going to extend some of these fields and wanted to make them larger, you could update the size. Most importantly though, here, I'm going to go ahead and rename a few of these fields. So I've taken out the discipline. So now I'm going to go down here and fix my disciplines. And the second field that came out of my conversion is actually going to be now called discipline. Oh, if I can type that properly. And then I'm going to call the first field that STEM, non-STEM to be my discipline group. Okay. And I'd really like that kind of in the same location that the discipline was earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and select those two fields, and I'm actually going to use my up and down arrows here at the top to push those all the way up to where discipline was in my original file. So now I've replaced that single discipline field with my kind of two separated fields. But again, unlike Excel, where maybe you would accidentally write over something or have challenges with your text to columns and where it fits, here we were able to make all of our changes, not leave any data behind, and bring our discipline in to kind of replace. But if at any point in time you didn't remember where did those two fields come from, you could work your way back through your workflow to your select and say, oh, yep, that's where I took out the discipline. And here where it says split discipline, we would remember, oh, yep, that's what I did to actually come up with those two new fields. Similarly for app date, I've taken the old one out. It had that odd string format. And now I'm just going to call my new app date. I'm going to rename that to app date. And now we will be off to the races. So we can go ahead and hit run here. Before I do that, though, just one other kind of note. In many of these menus or many of these configuration screens, there's an options menu. And in this case, I can go ahead and make kind of bulk changes. So we can clear some renames, we can move things around, sort. So I'm not going to mess around too much here, but you can even, if you're doing something similar across different workflows, you can actually save the configuration of this select tool so that you can load it later. So just a note on kind of how some of these configurations can get a little bit more interesting. So I've made my couple of updates, moved some fields around. You'll note here in pink, hopefully you can see that on the Zoom. Anything you change, whether that's a type, a size, or a rename, you'll see that highlighted in pink. So I can go ahead and run. Pardon me. And now we'll see on the output side of that select tool, if I scroll across, our initial discipline is gone and we've got our discipline group and our new discipline. And the only date remaining now is that converted application date. So great. So now we've kind of got our student identification information kind of prepped, and we're ready to start thinking about how do we leverage the scores.
Hey,
and
Matt,
so,
real quick,
sure.
We got a question in the chat from Susan asking with the naming conventions, are there any requirements or suggestions? Specifically, is there a disadvantage if you use spaces in names?
So for the most part, there's not a concern about using spaces in names. You know, when you output to Excel or the like, those will be handled appropriately. I would say the only scenario where perhaps spaces become an issue would be as we get into some more of the advanced capabilities that we're going to discuss tomorrow. So some of the R or Python tools that get into predictive or things like that, they might want names with no spaces, but in those cases, they'll actually, I would say, fix that for you, add underscores or the like to solve that. So I would say be kind of comfortable with how you rename with or without spaces to make it most readable for you and the audience that's going to consume your workflow. And also feel free to use that description field. I know I've talked to Kristen about the possibility of leveraging that for some of the workflows so that, you know, maybe people don't understand what the individual ID primary key is, and you want to put something along the lines of, you know, student identifier, or maybe even want to rename it. I'm not going to do that in our example today here, but you could certainly rename that to something more business friendly, so to speak. So hopefully, Susan, that helped. So now we've got our student data kind of ready to go, and now we want to start combining it with our scores. And the first step is we've got these two score files, and we really want to bring those together. So another question for the audience, does anybody remember the tool that we looked at during the presentation, the building block that would let us stack the data to then bring it together with the student data? Union, everybody's on this one. Thank you. Good job. So we can just grab that union tool and we're going to drag that onto the canvas. You'll notice I didn't connect it to any of my scores. I certainly could have. But I want to kind of show you that the union tool is a little different from some of the other tools we've dragged on earlier. You'll see on the input side, it kind of has this different input arrow. And what this one means is that this can accept any number of inputs. So in this case, we're just going to use 2, but you could imagine if you had a you know, an Excel file like this with 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 different tabs, you could combine them all with a single union tool. So we'll just go ahead and drag and drop, and you'll see that because the union tool has a different number of inputs, the input line actually gets named. So in this case, it's very elegant naming. It's number 1 and number 2. But if you did want to specifically document what that input was, you could actually click on the line itself, and you'll see here that it has a name. So you could go ahead and update this to say STEM or non-STEM or the like. I'm just going to stick with 1 and 2. And what that does is actually helps you as you start to think about configuring the union tool. So you'll see here, we're going to automatically configure by name. If you kind of ran that and things didn't work out the way you want, you might want to look at configuring by position if you really are comfortable with the structure of your file. But more often than not, I like to just kind of quickly look at the manual configuration. And here you can see all of the columns coming from our 2 data sets. And so you can actually look, and in this case, before even running the union tool, you can be comfortable that all of the fields line up between the 2 data sets. And so it makes you all the more comfortable to just stick with configuration by name. There are some options here I'm not going to get into in terms of warnings or errors if things aren't matching up. Sometimes if this is an early building block within a very large process and things don't match up, you might just want it to error out so that the rest of the, you know, perhaps time-consuming process doesn't continue. And then for very specific use cases, you might want to order the outputs. So you might want to stack 1 on top of 2 in this scenario, or you could switch it so 2 is stacked on top of 1. Most times you don't need to do that, but there are some very specific use cases where you might want to specify the order. So now we go ahead and hit run, and we are going to see our stacked data set. Now, a couple things I'll call out here as we look at that stack data set. So in our results grid, you'll see we have the same kind of change in terms of the format of the icons for the inputs and outputs. But I want to call out a couple things here. So one is that when you've got larger data sets, as these score data sets are, this bottom grid won't load all of the data. So you'll see here highlighted in the middle section of the results header is that we've got 7,000 odd records loaded into the results grid out of the 67,000+ records that are actually in the data set, okay? And if I click on the second input, similarly, we've got about 7,000 out of now 53,000 STEM data records that are brought in. And on the output side, same thing. We're displaying 7,000 out of 120,000. So that's just to remind you that, you know, as you kind of scroll through here, you aren't necessarily looking at your entire data set. And if you sort it, for example, for the highest GPAs, those highest GPAs would only be for the subset of 7,000 records that's in this results grid. Because there's 120,000 records, I am not going to drop a browse tool and connect it and run it. But if you wanted all of the data, you could go ahead and connect a browse tool, and then you would be able to look at all of the data. I'm going to do that a little bit down the road where we have a smaller subset of data. But here now we've got brought together our 120,000 student scores, excuse me, available to us for downstream processing. So now I want to blend them. I want to take my student information and I want to add my student scores to it. So does anybody remember from the deck which of our building blocks we would leverage for bringing these data sets together, blending them? I'll call it our VLOOKUP equivalent. Yes, everybody's got the join tool. Good job. So again, we're just going to drag and drop our join tool from the toolbar onto the canvas. I'm going to connect it here. There we go, to our student data. And then I can just drag and drop our scores over here to the join. So now we've got connections on the left and right in terms of input, and we can go ahead and configure our join tool. So you can join by record position. I'm not going to kind of get into that one today. It's not used nearly as commonly as joining by specific fields. And so if you think about joining by specific fields, this is similar to either SQL join, which we can talk about as well, or it's similar to what you would call a VLOOKUP in Excel. And so what we're going to basically say is that we are going to join on that individual ID primary key. And we happen to have one here on the right and on the left. You'll see that as soon as I filled that in, another row appeared. So similar to SQL, you can go ahead here and if you had different primary keys by state, for example, or the like, you could actually add multiple keys to your join. We just have the one. If you think about this in terms of VLOOKUP, this becomes a lot easier than your VLOOKUP. For a VLOOKUP, you would probably have to concatenate a bunch of fields together into one sheet and in the other sheet so that you could use that concatenated field for your VLOOKUP. In this case, you know, we could just add our 3 or 4 different key fields as our join criteria, and then we'd be off to the races. In terms of other capabilities of the join tool, it has what we call an embedded select tool. So down here at the bottom, you have all the capabilities that you do in the select tool, including renaming, you know, excluding, reordering, and the like. And all the changes here affect the J anchor, where everything has actually come together from both data sets. In this case, you'll see that I've ended up with a duplicate of the individual primary key, one from the left data set and one from the right data set. I'm just going to go ahead and turn off the second of those. I only need that once in my output data set. But again, I could do renaming and the like here if I liked. As you're getting comfortable with the join tool, I really like this Venn diagram analogy that is in the configuration screen. So if you start with the J, it really shows you that the inner join is taking everything from the two data sets for which those primary key individual keys matched up, joined. And then on the left output anchor, you get anything on the left side that wasn't a part of the right side. And then similarly, the right anchor is things on the right side that didn't have a match on the left. So again, just helping remind you what the three anchors are that we're going to get here when we hit run. Okay, so now it's going to read in all our data again, stack our scores, and join that all up. And so we can take a look then through our outputs. So in this case, on the left anchor, so students with no scores, we have no data, right? So this is great. The wonderful scenario where everything matched up, at least from the left side. On the join, we've got 1,200 records. And then on the right side, we've got 119,000 records. So in this case, we have scores from perhaps, all over the country, but we're only looking at a subset of students for whom we're going to do our analysis. So if I were in a business environment, maybe in your environment, I might continue on the right side here with a little bit of analysis to make sure that the outputs that I was seeing on the right side were comfortable to me, maybe some quick data quality check to make sure I was getting what I expected through the join and not missing anything on the right side. But in this scenario, we're just going to focus specifically on those students that we loaded and continue our analysis coming out of the join anchor. Let me just pause and see. I'm going to have a sip of water and see if anybody has any questions now that we've brought our data together. Okay, great. So the next step we're going to do is we're going to calculate for each of.
Matt, looks like a question came in.
Oh, it did come in. Jared, looks like Jared's doing a great job of answering his own question. So absolutely, Jared, if you wanted to do a left or right join or a full join, you would absolutely use the union tool after the join to see kind of a more, call it complete result. So actually, let's just for the sake of, let me just quickly do that just so that other folks on the line can understand what you're saying. So we might want to actually see the joined data and the data from the right because we want to see all the scores. And if we union those together, and you'll see here, we're going to leave it as config by name. When we hit run, what's going to happen is we're going to get both outputs. And for those who aren't as comfortable as Jared is with the SQL terminology and the like, you can, what you'll see here is that in our union, we're getting a whole bunch of warning messages. And those warning messages are basically letting us know that R anchor doesn't have all of the components that are part of the student data. And that's to be expected because the R output is the R data that didn't have joins. And so when we look at our actual data, you'll see here for many, many, many of these students, 119,000 of these score records, there is no student data. And if we scrolled and scrolled, then hopefully eventually we would hit the portion, or we could actually come in here and filter and say is not null, and we could see those students for whom we had a match. But you certainly can set up that union for you to see all of it. So I'm going to leave that out of my flow, but I think Jared, to your question, that's exactly what you would do to bring together all of the components of the inputs.
Matt, oh,
yeah, I've got it. Thanks. Yeah, I've got it. Right. So Scott, the difference between a join and a union is the way the data is brought together. So if I start with the union, you're really stacking the data. So if you think about it in Excel terms, I might have a spreadsheet with, in this case, STEM data on one tab and non-STEM on the other tab that have the same structure. And I just want to put one set of data on top of the other. So you're stacking the data. The join is actually putting the data next to each other based on a common key, similar to what a VLOOKUP would do. So your join data, the student data is on the left and the scores are on the right. And so they're actually brought together in a single record. Hopefully that answered that, Scott. Got it. Okay, and then try, let's look at the time here. Let me come back, Danny and Connor, if you could remind me at the end to come back to a little bit of the visual configuration and some of the user settings. I want to make sure we get to output, and then we can come back on some of the settings.
You got it.
Thank you. Okay, so now we've got our data brought together. So for those students that we care about who are in our student information file, we're now going to go ahead and do some analysis on their performance and kind of by state and county. And so one of the things we want to calculate is their percentile rank within their high school. So first and foremost, if we want to calculate a new field, do you remember in any of the discussions, I didn't talk to this tool specifically, but which tool do you think we might use, excuse me, to create ourselves a new field, a new calculation? Anybody out there? Formula, absolutely correct, Jared, absolutely. So we can go ahead and grab the formula tool and drag it on the canvas. We'll connect it to that J. So you see as I move it, it wants to connect depending on which one I'm closest to. If it just becomes too too challenging, you can just drop it anywhere. And just a tip, if you do have this challenge of connecting it to the right output anchor, you can actually right click on the line and you'll see an option to switch the origin. So you can switch that to left or right. In this case, we'll just keep that connected to the J for the join. And now we want to create a calculation for our high school percentile rank. So you'll see here in the formula tool, there's a number of different things going on. So the first thing you have to do is select a column. So you actually have two options here, right? One is add a column, which is what we're going to do. The other is to actually update an existing column. So in the case, like let's take our app date that we updated before. We could have actually come in and updated that here within a formula tool. But what I'll tell you is when you're updating a column, you can't change the data type. So in the case of our app date, although we could work with the app date, we wouldn't be able to change it from a string to a date here within the formula tool. So that's why we do need something like the convert app date formula, or we'd have to create a new field. But we can go ahead here and add a new column. We're not going to update an existing one. We're going to call this, what fun name should I call this? I'm going to call this high school percentile. And now I need to go ahead and create a formula. So before I start creating the formula, I'm actually going to change the data type. So by default, we come out with a string data type. I'm going to make sure that this is a double. Again, we have different numeric data types and string data types within Alteryx. If you're not kind of comfortable with that, I would suggest a quick look on community around data types. But our double is our largest floating point number. So we'll go ahead and use a double. And now to create my calculation, I've got a number of options here on the left. I'm just going to focus on the first two. So functions. So here we could actually go in and look at all of the different functions that are available to us within Alteryx. So a bunch of math calculations and the like. I got a pretty simple calculation. I'm just going to take their rank and I'm going to divide it by the school size and I'm going to multiply it by 100. So I don't really have a whole lot of advanced math here. So I'm actually just going to go to that second icon that says constants and fields. And I'm going to pick from my existing columns, scroll down here, and I get to my high school rank number. And I can go ahead and select that. Then I'm going to divide that. And again, I can go back to my list. If I was pretty comfortable with what this was, like I saw there was quantity in it, I could actually start typing and it'll come up in my select list and I can just go ahead and select that. So you'll see here now, if I take the rank divided by the quantity, you'll see this person's in the 68th percentile, but I don't really like that format. I'd really like to see it multiplied by 100, so it looks a little bit more like what you would traditionally see. So now I can see that this is actually a preview of the first data record. So I can see that whoever was first in our data set has a 68th percentile rank within their high school. So once I've got that, I can go ahead and hit run. And similar to all the other tools now, on the right output anchor, I will have my new field, and you'll see on the bottom I already selected on the output. Now I've got my new high school percentile here. Any questions on the formulas come in? No. Pretty straightforward. Obviously, these can get super complex as you do string conversions or calculations or advanced math and the like. So now we've got our high school percentage. And now I'm going to teach you a little trick. A little trick is that you can go ahead and right-click on these tools, and particularly these ones like formula that have one input and one output. And one of the options that comes in when you do that, it says cache and run workflow. So this workflow isn't terribly large. So, reading the scores files takes a little while, but it's not too bad. But when you get larger and larger input files, some of these processes can run for a little while. And so it's often convenient to cache and run your workflow. And what that does for the folks who are kind of familiar with caching concepts is basically it freezes everything up into our formula tool. And you'll see the little kind of ice cubes around it. And it basically saves a copy of our data right here at the formula. So all that work you've done, we're now saved to a single data set that looks at our high schools and our rank. And it saves it at that point. So from now on, our runs are going to be super quick because we've kind of brought all our data together already. So now I am going to do some work with my data that I brought together. So we've brought together the student data, we've brought in the scores, and we've calculated that high school rank. And now we want to do some analysis. And the analysis we've been asked to do is to give some information by state and by county on the average, call it student, coming from that state and that county. And so we want to see how many students there were in that state and county. And then we want to see the average GPAs, math scores, science scores, and then the average rank or percentile, sorry, at their given school. So does anybody know what tool from our presentation we might use to summarize that information for our analytic? Summarize, yeah. I slipped and actually used the word in my question, so that was bad on me. But all good. That is absolutely the correct answer. We've got the summarize tool up here in the favorites toolbar or under the transform toolbar. Here we're really starting to transform our data into a very different layout and format. So we can just drag that after our formula tool. And now if you remember from the presentation, we have kind of two capabilities. So the one is that capability to group by things. So that's for each of our, in this case, states or counties, we're going to see a result. And then we've got kind of that numeric component where we're going to do those averages that I talked about. So here we can just scroll down our list and we can find the state in our data set. And so we select that here in the upper grid, and now we choose what action we want to do with the state. And so for that, for each scenario, for each state, we're going to use the group by. And here you'll see it's called state. On the output side, I could rename that, but state's pretty straightforward. Also going to do county. So I'm going to group on the county name. And now my data that I want that count of how many students are coming out of that county, and then I want the averages of kind of all their school results. So to get the number of students, does anybody have a suggestion on what I might do to actually get the number of students that are in a given county? Super team, that is absolutely correct. And I apologize if I pronounced your name incorrectly, but we're going to go up here and we're going to choose that individual ID, and we are going to go ahead and count it. Now, what you'll see here is that when we put that ID in and we count it, our output field name is just count. You know, that's not super helpful if you, especially if you have multiple counts in the same output. So we're going to go ahead and call this amount of students. And to the question earlier, I think maybe from Susan, or I'm not sure who, but we just, my naming convention often includes underscores. It certainly doesn't have to. So now we've got our number of students, and now we want to go and average all of these great scores that we have down here. So we've got their GPA. So let's go ahead and add, and average doesn't appear kind of in our quick list here, but if we go under numeric, here's now where we've got our average. So we can add our GPA, and then I've got all these ACT and SAT scores. I want to add all those too and average them. So instead of selecting each of these one by one and averaging, I can actually, you know, pretty typical Windows capability, I can select the first one, hold down the shift key and select the last one. I can go ahead and hit add, go to numeric and average. And so now I've got all my average scores coming through. And I'm just going to add the average for the percentile as well. So now we're going to see for each state and county, how many students and what were the average scores. So let's go ahead and run that and see what we get. Okay, here we go. So here we've got a couple of counties in Georgia and Maryland. And for each one, we've got the number of students and their average GPA scores and the like. So how many people love the way that that looks from an output perspective? Probably not too many. The average is and gets kind of confusing and perhaps even a little bit ugly. So what's a tool that we've used already that we might go into to do some renaming and make our output look a little bit more usable from a business end user perspective? Select, absolutely, Stephen, thanks. So we can go use our select tool again, and we can update each of these to have the field names that we want. So maybe high school GPA, ACT underscore math. What I'm going to tell you, I'm going to type all these in. As you get more comfortable with the Alteryx environment, there is a very cool tool that sits in the developer toolbar. Do not be intimidated by the term developer, but it's kind of that next step. It is called the dynamic rename. And we could actually, just tell dynamic rename to go ahead and get rid of all these averages, but that's not one of the tools in today's curriculum, so we'll go with a renaming here. Does anybody know another way we could have done this? Maybe just a reminder. The summarize tool actually gives you that capability as well, right? So we could have just done that all in here as well. But just a reminder, select tool is great. You can go rename these fields, move them around and the like. Any questions? No, looking pretty good. Okay, so now we want to output this data and we want to do a couple things. So we want to have an Excel file that has one tab for each state. And we also want each state's tab to be sorted based on the, number of students and the GPA. So almost always in Alteryx, you're going to do kind of the setup of the data before you do any output. So I know it's going to be really innovative. We have a sort tool, and it sorts data. So we can go ahead up to the toolbar and grab the sort tool from the palette. And basically, the sort tool is pretty straightforward. You're just going to pick which column. So in this case, I'm going to pick the amount of students, and I'm going to sort that descending, so the largest counties first. And then from there, I am going to sort on GPA, also descending. So largest counties, and then sort the GPAs within those counties. If for some reason you had data in a different language, you could go here, select a different dictionary to use for your sorting. We'll stick with standard English in this scenario. One thing I ran into a couple weeks ago, just remind folks, is if you changed your mind on the sort order, but you like the fields, you have these up and down arrows on the right side that you can use, as well as the minus to get rid of fields. So just, configuration of the sort tool is fairly straightforward, but a couple of things you can do. So now if we run this, we're going to have our data sorted on the output side based on the size of the county and the number of students. Now, what you'll notice is I did not sort that by state. From your perspective as a business analyst or a user of the tool, you might want to go ahead and do that to make yourself comfortable with the data and to kind of see what your results are going to be. The reason you don't have to do that, however, is that the output tool is going to handle kind of the state component of this for you. So I leave that to you as you get comfortable with your workflow, whether you would want to do that or not. But our last step here in the flow is really to output. And there's a couple of pieces to output that I'll mention. Same configuration as input. I just go and tell it that I want to output an Excel file. I'll just bring my window up here. I'm going to just write over top of my average county scores by state that I had built previously. And I'm going to tell it that I'm going to write to sheet 1. And the sheet in this case doesn't matter all that much because I'm going to overwrite the answer. So I've got a couple of options here, the most important one being my output options. If you do create a new sheet, if you try to overwrite the file, it's going to give you an error because you can't create a file that already exists. So most often we overwrite the sheet arrange. And then you can append some fields and do formatting. For the interest of time, I'm just going to go down here and let you know that you can take the name of the tab within your Excel file from an existing field. So I'm going to go ahead and choose to change the tab name, in this case, to the state. So each state is going to have its own tab. And then it's up to you whether you want to actually leave the state in the tab as well, or you can actually turn that off. So I'll leave it turned on so you can actually see when you're in the tab that it's North Carolina data. We'll go ahead and hit run. And now when we click, we see that 6 different tabs were all written to that one spreadsheet. And we can click on the name. It's bringing up Excel on my other screen. I'll move it over to this one here in just a second. And you can see that we output the 6 tabs for each of the states that we have. Sorry, my Excel's not happy with me at this moment. Okay, here we go. Shoot. I'd like to tell you. There we go. Sorry about that. So here we go. We've got our Georgia data, our Maryland data, et cetera, et cetera. So Alteryx has taken all that data and flowed it through to our one output, one Excel file. And at this point, certainly you would want to go ahead and save to your either server or to your hard drive, so that you can then, once this data updates, go ahead and just run your workflow again. So I believe, Danny, correct me if I'm wrong, we've got about 4 minutes to go.
It looks like on the website we're actually 7 minutes over. So.
Oh, I apologize then. My apologies.
I think originally it was 11:20. I thought too, but
okay. So my apologies, folks. I ran over a little bit. At this point, I would encourage you to reach out to the team there at ASU if you have questions, or to go to the Success Center and download a copy of Alteryx. If you haven't used it before, try out the trial. Once you've had a chance with the trial, then Kristen and the team would be happy to talk to you about getting a permanent license with the ASU keys and the like. If there are other questions, Danny, I'm happy to stay on and answer. I see a couple of questions. I know a couple have come in, but certainly understand if people need to jump to their next calls. But thank you all. I appreciate your time, and I'll jump back to Try's question if Try is going to stay on, and excuse me, Susan, I can answer your question as well.
Okay. Susan and Try and Super Team also was wondering if there's a way to round up to 2 decimal places.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump to take them in order. So the options in terms of viewing the data or viewing the workflow itself, if you come up here to options, user settings, and edit user settings, there's a number of capabilities here to edit, and I won't go into all of them, but on the canvas, you have the opportunity to change your background. So if you're one of those dark mode kind of users, you can change your backgrounds around and foregrounds. But specifically to the question here under connection settings, the type defaults to auto route Bezier, which is that rounded. If you like the perpendicular lines like I do, you can use the auto route perpendicular. Straight lines will just connect it diagonal, whatever it is, to just get it from A to B. So that's where you would go there, user settings for the connection type. In terms of Super Team's question, way to round numbers, absolutely. You can round the easiest way, actually, and I'm not going to get into all the different possibilities, but one way you could do it is if you come in here and choose a fixed decimal, then you can actually make this, like 19.2. So it's 19 size and only 2 digits. So that would be one way. Depending on the output and what you want to do, the reporting tools have capabilities to round as well. So most often I find that downstream processes really want to see all of the precision. And so if I was outputting to Excel and somebody else might use it for analysis, I would leave all the decimals. But if I was doing it more in terms of a report, I might use a report table where I could format that output to 2 characters. So, so you can kind of take both of those any number of those approaches as you kind of get comfortable with the environment. And then Susan, excuse me, the answer for Susan becomes a little bit more complicated in that Excel is its own interesting monster in terms of the way things are named. And so using the file name or table name here in Excel is just going to overwrite the name of the tab. And so in this case, you would have each of the tabs states as their own tab. But if you look at the kind of format of the file name, you can see, it's basically the file name with the three pipes and then the name of the sheet. And so what you could do is earlier in your workflow, you could actually develop a format similar to that for the field name. So instead of just state, it would be file name and tab name. And then you would change the entire file path. And that would basically result in as many or as few files as you want. So if you kept the file name consistent, they would all write to the same file. If you had different file names, then it would write multiple files. So using the formula tool, usually you would build up a bigger file path with both this file name and the sheet name in one field, and then you would overwrite that in the output tool. So hopefully, Susan, if you were able to stay on, that made sense for you.
Yeah, Matt, one thing I might add on that, Susan, a really quick way to get around that is just instead of an Excel file, just use a CSV and do that same change file name function, and it'll actually create multiple files instead of tabs. So just a quick little cheat there. It's not the same Excel file, but CSV just does allow you to toggle from a field like the state that we have in this example.
Yeah, it's a good call out, Connor. It very much depends on what you're thinking about. Perfect. Okay, I didn't see any other questions come in, Danny. Did you?
No, I think we've got them all.
Okay, well, thank you for hosting, Danny. Appreciate it. Thank you, Connor, and thank you all for joining.
Yeah, big thanks to Matt and Connor for their great presentation. I know we're all getting a little closer to leveling up and becoming awesome data slayers, get those monsters. And thanks for coming to the intro. And make sure you keep in mind, check the website for the schedule. And in the Slack, make sure you also send out a celebration, give someone a shout out if you got one. We thank you all for coming.
Thanks.